the 19th day of March,
Can you believe it?
2026, and I am thrilled to have the legend, Don Sandy, in our midst. And Don, as every meeting I've ever been to, you always walk in the event, start the event with a certain song. So could you share that with us? Just like baseball players have walk-up music, this is the walk-up music for every suite.
Yeah, very sweet. Johann Posnippen.
Is that what it's called?
That's the name of that song, yeah.
Yeah, well, you played it forever, and that's indelibly marked. And you know, you got this, and while you're holding it, because you're so noted for your dedication to Scandinavian culture, but also you demonstrate that through not only the outfit you have on, but also the accordion you play. So could you talk a little bit about everything that you have here? What's the accordion? What's the outfit? And could you describe it?
Well, my parents bought this accordion for me in the 1950s. And I didn't realize at the time the sacrifices that they did to get me into the accordion. And of course, I wanted the one with all the bells and whistles that was advanced in those days. And so this is a quality accordion that has lasted 70 years, you know, and so thankful for it. Used to be accordion repairman in Jamestown, Sven Hillering. He used to work in the old Swedish accordion factory that was here in Jamestown. And he could fix it a little bit, but those days are gone and there isn't anybody to fix them anymore. But this is still going on strong, and I'm so thankful for it.
And it's called an Excelsiola?
That's the brand, yes.
It's a brand, yeah.
Yeah.
Where does it come out of? Is it from Sweden or
It's actually from Italy.
Italy?
Yeah.
Yep. And then once we take the accordion aside, you are wearing an outfit which is very traditional, and I suspect there's a story and a name to all that as well.
Well, this is a typical male costume and folk costume. And I've always wanted one, and growing up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we had one that had been put together and so on. But I thought I'd be interested in getting an original one. So on one of our trips to Sweden, we were staying with some friends that we had became friends with. And he was a fiddle player with Sigtuna Spillman, a band over there. And his wife also played the fiddle, but she was also a folk dancer. Well, anyway, they had a gig at Skansen Park, which is an outdoor museum in Stockholm. And so we went along with them for that, you know, in order to appreciate what they were doing and be part of it and so on. And while there was a man who was helping to put up the sound system, you know, and he was doing it all by himself, and he had to run and adjust his speaker, come back. And I was sitting there doing nothing, and I said, could I give you a hand, you know, to go do this? And so we worked together a little bit, and we got it all set up. And a little bit later, he said, is there anything you wanted to do while you were in Sweden that you haven't been able to do? And I said, well, I always thought maybe I wanted to get an original Swedish folk dance costume. And because I knew that the tailors in downtown Stockholm would be exorbitant. And he says, are you serious that you really want a costume? And I said, yeah. Incidentally, this guy was just there that day. He was covering for the regular sound guy who was sick. So by luck, he was there. And he says, I'm the president of the Swedish Society for the Preservation of Folk Costumes. I thought, what? You know, of all the people in Sweden,
Yeah.
I'm sitting down. He says, are you really want a costume? And I said, yes. And I said, okay, I'll have somebody here in 15 minutes to measure you.
Oh, my God.
And it turned out to be his wife. She makes Swedish folk dance costumes. You know, and I thought, I think this is meant to be, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, what are the odds of something like that? Just because the other guy was sick on the same day that we were sitting there in Wisconsin. So she came and measured me, and she fixed it all up and so on. She says, because each province area in Sweden, costumes vary a little bit, and you can tell where somebody is from based on their costume. And I was interested in one where my grandfather came from in Södermanland. And she goes, that's the very last costume that I made for somebody else from that same land. So I could make another one, easy. I thought, I guess I'm supposed to get this costume. So several months later, it came in the mail. This is all hand woven and according to the pattern, and the pants and the were all shirt, all this. It's a little pricey still, but it was at the time I was getting ready for retirement and so on, and had a little bit of extra money. So my wife and I, we agreed it's time to get a costume.
Terrific. Of all the gin joints in all the world, there you have.
Can you believe it?
I know it. Well, you know, Wisconsin is such a great place. You know, it's got everything. It's such a huge location. Oh, that's fantastic, Don. So that's a great story. Probably a good time to talk a little bit about your mom and dad. Give us a little genealogy.
Well, two of my grandparents were born in Sweden and came over, and one great-grandparent was born in Sweden, and my grandmother was born just shortly after they arrived here. So maybe she was conceived in Sweden, I don't know, but I haven't figured that out yet. So I have 75% ancestors, you know, from Sweden. Now, as was typical of growing up in Swedish community, they wanted their children to grow up to be Americans because now we're in this country. And I didn't get to learn from them the Swedish languages or anything like that. And the one thing that I can remember that my mom did that was Swedish was we had lutefisk every Christmas. Now, I put a stop to that after I got older, but because I really wasn't into that. But she always made lutefisk at Christmas time.
Wow.
I wish.
By the way, what's your mom and dad's name?
My dad is Chester Sandy, and my mother was Edna Carlson Sandy. She was originally from Kane, and my dad was from Iowa.
Well, Kane, Pennsylvania, just a personal thing, that Kane, Ludlow, Brookston, all that area, that's where my dad's, Lyle Peterson's, family all came from. All Swedes, Mount Jewett, that whole area, which I
Yeah.
know you play at.
They probably knew each other.
Probably, yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Good old Edna Carlson. And then, what brought them here? Was there a logical? Did they grow up here in Jamestown, or was there a draw here?
I think a job.
Okay.
You know, they came to Jamestown after they got married, and I was born here in Jamestown and grew up here in Jamestown. So that has been my hometown for my whole life.
And Chester, where did he work?
Chester was in the art metal plant, and he had been there a very long time. And that plant, as we know, got bought out by another company that raided the pension funds and all these kinds of things that are illegal now. So after 30-some years, when he retired, everything was gone, which is a sad story on somebody trying to build a career.
Sure.
But we were a happy family. We grew up on Hall Avenue. Typical from the 50s. I graduated from high school in 1961 at Jamestown High School.
Siblings?
Sibling, I have one sibling, my brother Gail. He became a pharmacist and was known in the community here. He basically, in his career, managed the village pharmacy in Faulkner.
Yep, remember Gail very well. And then as a young child, did you have any hobbies?
Hobbies. My number one hobby, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a hobby, is family. That's the most important thing to me, is family. The second most important thing is my Swedish heritage. You know, I don't understand why, but I've had this passion for my whole life about Sweden, and I can't explain why. When I was a kid, I used to collect postage stamps. You know, we had this little book you would glue them into and so on. And I was particularly proud of the Swedish stamps. And I thought, this is from my heritage. And so that stuck with me from an early age, that identity of being Swedish was key. Subsequently, later on in life, my work took me to Washington, D.C. periodically for conferences and so on. And I would take all free time I could to go to the National Archives to look up genealogy work. And we were looking up one census record, and it said in the census record that my relative was German. I said, German? I'm not German. I got nothing against German people, but I panicked because I thought, this is my identity. And I went up to the clerk that was working there, you know, and I said, I've always understood that I was Swedish, and this says German. He says, well, you're German now. And I thought, oh my gosh. But later on, I was able to prove that there was a mistake in it. And you know how census takers go out and they get information and data. Who knows they collect it from. But it was an error, and it really was Swedish.
There we go.
So I felt a lot better.
Good, you corrected
So,
it.
you know, that has been there. And then the next level down is genealogy. I am so fascinated about family history, you know, and the genealogy and so on. And I subscribe to Ancestry and so on. And I'm gathering all this data up, and so far in a booklet with copies of wills and copies of birth certificates and so on, of about 700 pages
Wow.
of stuff that has been written. And that's just on my dad's side. And that's what panics me a little bit as I get older, is I need time to finish this, you know? And sometimes life gets in the way of doing some of the things that you may want to get done.
Yeah.
But I've got to set aside the time, you know, to be able to work on those kinds of things. Much to the chagrin of my family at times, it's like, no more Swedish stuff, you know. You know, not really. They've been very supportive, and they are part of this movement and part of this appreciation of their cultural identity.
Your mom and dad were active in some of the Swedish organizations,
Right.
weren't they?
Yeah. My dad and mom were both very active in the Thule Lodge in particular. And at that time, in the 50s, 60s, it was the largest Vasa lodge in the world. You know, 1,200 or more members. It was on Pine Street, and it was crowded to get in there, particularly to go up for dinners on Friday nights or whatever.
remember.
You had to stand in line and, or sign up and so on. And my dad became chairman of the lodge, and then he was district master for the whole New York conference and so on, which involved him traveling. My mom was head of the children's club for several years and part of the drill teams that they had, and they would go around and help to do installations at other lodges in Chicago and other places where they would participate in helping to install officers in other Vasa lodges. But they were extremely active with that, and so I grew up in being part of the Lucia part of pageant there and so on, so.
Were you a little tumpty?
Pardon?
Were you a little tumpty?
I was a little tumpty. Tip, top, tippy, tippy, tip, top, tip, top.
There you go, Ed. You may not appreciate that, but that was my son, Brent, was a tumpty. I don't know if he could have done that, sang that like that. He's a singer now, so I'll have to check on him. But part along the way, you're known so much Swedish music, Tumpty, Lucia Festival, but ultimately the accordion. Who introduced you to that? Was that in the family? Were they musicians?
I don't know of any other musicians in the family. And I don't know what kind of agreement there was to get it all started. But it all began when I was 7 years old. And my dad in particular and my mom also were really intrigued with having the accordion going. And so I agreed to participate with lessons, and I was involved with Victor Hager, who taught accordion here. And I took lessons for 10 years over that time. I grew up from a small accordion to the middle size, and then, like I said, eventually the big maestro accordion here. I could remember sometimes where I hated the accordion. I didn't want to practice. The kids were outside playing, and I had to practice, but my mom was insisting that I get my practice time in. Back in those days, I can remember one particular day where on cereal boxes, they had these mask figures that you could cut out. You put a string on and you could put the mask on. Mm-hmm. And the kids were out doing their masks from the cereal boxes. And I was inside practicing. And I was disappointed in that, but now I'm thankful for it. If I had been completely at my own will, I probably wouldn't have stuck with it for very long. Who knows? Maybe I would have. But I appreciate that support and that encouragement to be a part of it.
Yeah.
When the relatives from Kane would come up to visit, they always wanted me to get the accordion out and play something. And I was always embarrassed and sloppy to be able to do that kind of a thing. But one of my uncles says, "I'll give you a big nickel," which turned out to be a quarter. "But I gave you a big nickel if you played the accordion," kind of a thing. So that encouraged me to be able to do it. But when you get to be high school graduate, and now I went to Jamestown Community College, so I was still here in town. But then when you go out of town to school, the accordion sort of gets shelved to the side. So there were several years in between there, where I wasn't doing the accordion. And I remember one time, finally, when I'd come back down home and we were married and settled down, and my dad said, "If nobody's going to pick this up, I'm going to sell it." He put an investment in it. I didn't realize at the time, but when I was cleaning out their papers after they were gone, I saw where they had borrowed from their life insurance policies to pay for this accordion.
Oh my gosh.
That's how important it was for them, for me to be able to get this, Now, my brother got into the accordion too. So he took lessons and he played, and then he got accordions. But anyway, so I wasn't as much into it, but I would do a little bit here or there. And Ray Wheeler, I don't know if you remember him way back, and they used to have the Scout program weekly on the radio station.
Yes.
And he would always have me come every week and play a tune
Oh, my gosh.
on that Scout show. So that kind of a thing encouraged me back in those days too. But the whole Swedishness of the accordion wasn't a highlight at that time. It was later on. It's kind of an interesting story, but it's a sad story in a way. There was the Swedish folk dance team, which I wasn't part of back in the late 60s, early 70s. And Einar Wolf, a fiddle player who played for the dance team, was going to go to Sweden for the summer. And they had some performances they needed to do for like midsummer celebrations and so on. And they didn't have music for it. So they asked me if I could step in to play for them for the summer. And they said, it's just until Einar Wolf comes back and then he can take it over again. So I did that. And it was kind of fun, and they appreciated the fact on the accordion there's a bass, so you can hear the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, which you don't hear with a fiddle. And that helped them with the dancing and so on, so they liked the accordion. But the sad part of the story, but that had a major effect on my career, was while Einar Wolf was in Sweden at that time, he passed away.
Oh, okay.
So he never came back. So I've been playing now since the 1970s with the Thule Lodge Swedish folk dance team during that time period. So we've seen generations of people pass through the team, from children's dancers who become adult dancers and so on. And I still am playing with them, and we practice weekly. It's a concern of mine because I'm the best Swedish accordion player around, because I'm the only Swedish accordion player around. But that's what concerns me, is what's happened when I can't play anymore, you know? And that's typical of what most Swedish folk dance teams have faced, is that they start using recorded music. And we're one of the only dance teams that still has live music. Now, we have 2 fiddle players who play also, so they would continue with it, but Kathy Peterson and Cheryl Rich, and they're an important part of all that. But that started me into the Swedish music, and it just grew from that point on. So in a sense, I was filling a vacuum, because in the old days, there were a number of accordion players around, like Sexton Lindblom and Dave Dunberg. And every time you went to a Thule event, they were playing their accordions, which I would sit down and listen to, and it was intriguing. You know, they would just play by ear, meaning they didn't need the music. They could hear it and then work it out and play it. And I'm a book learner, unfortunately. I'm not as adept at playing with the by ear. But anyway, so eventually I filled into that. So I stepped into where there was a vacuum. There wasn't anything else like this going on, you know, so I filled in with that, you know, and if there had been 10 other Swedish accordion players in town, I don't know where I would have stacked up. But like I said, I'm the best one in town.
Curious, you know, a couple of things you've said, which I fell completely off of personally, because my mother was an accomplished pianist, and your biggest fan, by the way. And
Helsa Demner Hemma.
that's right.
You had to play that all the time.
And you may have to before this is over. But yeah, and you did it for my mother's we recorded it for her like 80th birthday. And anyway, she would want me to take the lessons and to teach the piano. And I was the guy who instead went out and played ball. I was the guy who chose what you did not choose. So when you say you, as much as you wanted to play, you did, and when the day was done, you're glad you chose the way you chose. I would give anything to be able to sit down, candidly, and I'm admitted this for the camera, to sit down on a piano and to just play piano.
You know, it's not too
Play,
late.
you know, my wife tells me that.
It's not too late.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that encouragement. Now, I was also curious, Don, because you play, you know, when I'm in your world, Swedish music. You play Swedish music. Yet accordions are used. The Italian festival has accordions. Certainly the Polish with the polka, that is their main thing. Do you ever dabble in that genre at all?
I figured when I have perfected Swedish music, then I'll play something else. And I haven't got to that point yet, you know? And because, as you mentioned, I'm the Swedish accordion player in the community, and that there were previous generations of people who had accordions around, now families are wondering what to do with this accordion that's been sitting in the attic for 20 years or whatever, you know? And at household sales, nobody's buying them. So I get this call periodically, are you interested in an accordion? You know, and it's hard to say no, so I say yes. So I've got 5 or 6 accordions, you know, that I have. None of them are as good as this, and most of them need a repair job, which, like I said earlier, you can't get. But at the same time, they have sheet music of Swedish music, of books and accordion recordings and so on. And so I get these packages of Swedish music, and I have at least a pile 5 feet high of just Swedish music. And I haven't been through 10% of it. You know, it's, and I probably never will. And I don't know who's going to get 5 feet of Swedish music when I'm gone. But anyway, it's there.
Well, it's, maybe we're getting ahead of the story a little bit, but again, I was thinking my own personal thing. My mother collected all of Swedish, Chachi stuff, but also Swedish music, books, you name it. And I'm sure we're not unique. And other people don't know what to do with it. The next generation has no clue. Right. And my immediate thought was to call Don Sandy.
That's what happened.
And
exactly.
I
got some of that.
Yeah. I assume others do the same thing.
The same thing.
And we should point for the record that your wife's name is Sandy. Sandy.
Sandra Sandy.
Yes. And a little bit, how did you meet with her? How'd you meet her? We're doing this for the kids. They need to know.
When I was mentioned earlier, I went to Jamestown Community College, my first 2 years of school. And I was part of the chorus there at the school with Richard Corbin.
Sure.
He was a classic conductor, creative person that the students just loved. And there was this girl I noticed in the choir that, lo and behold, I became brave enough to ask out for a date. This girl was in nurses training at the WCA Hospital School of Nursing, which now is long gone too. And she lived in the dorm there, as all the students did. And so I called her, and she said, I hung up. She said yes right away. And she said that she told her dorm, guess who called me? Don Sandy called me to go out for a date. And somebody said, if something happens to this, you'll be Sandy, you know. And he says, I haven't even gone out with him yet, kind of a thing, but then the rest is history, I guess, what you say. I was pre-enrolled in the Lutheran seminary, thinking I wanted to become a Lutheran pastor. And so I went to Wagner College on Staten Island, which was a Lutheran school. And I had to go to that school because I had one of those scholarships from the state, Regent scholarships, which would be good if you go to school in New York State. New York State. So I went there, but I had this budding relationship with this girl back here in Jamestown. And Wagner College had a long history of courses you had to take to graduate, like you needed to take a history course, you had to take an economics course, and so on. And these are basic courses that I could very easily take back here. So I pre-arranged with Wagner to be able to come back here during my junior year, second half of my junior year, to take some courses at Fredonia and Jamestown that would transfer and qualify for the junior year. I think it had something to do with that girl that was back here,
Very
in
strategic.
Jamestown. And at that point, I ended up realizing that I don't think the ministry was the right place for me, but social work was. So I completed my bachelor's degree in psychology at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and then decided to stay on and do my master's degree in social work there in Buffalo. And with a sense that I needed to do this to help people as part of a ministry, in the same sense of being a pastor, but being a minister in another way. And so I was immediately hired by George Stevens at Gustavus Adolphus Children's Home, in 1967, I guess it was, as a caseworker. And so I worked there and through various positions and supervisor and coordinator and so on, and became eventually the administrator, all individually as well as a team administration. We had a team concept, and it was very much a team-oriented thing. So we were all peers running the facility. So I was there 37 and a half years, and providing what was recognized, and again, it's not me, it was the staff that was there with us, the best facility in Western New York. Kids would come to us from the courts in Buffalo, the judges say, I'm sending you to the very best program that exists. Make the most of it, kind of a thing. And we were really proud of the depth and the quality of the program that we had there at the children's home. We were able to open some group homes in the community and so on. And so that went very well. When I left there, I still had this passion about being part of the Lutheran community. So for a few years, I worked with Thrivent Financial for Lutherans, life insurance and annuities and so on. And again, my ministry with them was to help people get their ducks in order. They get beneficiaries that hadn't been amended, and it was still part of this ministry. But Thrivent wanted me to sell, and I wasn't as good at selling as I was helping people. So eventually decided to leave that and so on. But all along, this Swedish connection and this Lutheran connection have driven me through my career. When I was back in the late 50s, early 60s, I helped to open the first McDonald's up in Lakewood when it was just the Golden Arches kind of a thing. And I excelled, that's the right word, but I did a very good job at that. And I was going to college at the time, JCC, before I got married. And the manager came and says, I'd like to have you drop out of college and go to our hamburger school administration training program. Go for that. You know, I thought, I couldn't see that as my ministry. I couldn't see that developing a business like that as being what I was all about.
Sure.
I would have made a lot more money getting into the McDonald's career in the early 60s. But, you know, money isn't what it's all about. You need money to be comfortable in life, but you also have a sense of ministry, of mission, of purpose, you know, and that you can accomplish something for people, you know, and that's what's been most important for me.
You know, I'm not sure everybody would have understood. I mean, they knew the name Gustavus Adolphus. It was a school, it was a home, it was certainly part of the Ministry of Lutheran Social Services of Upper and then upstate New York and then Upper New York, I forget the terms.
Yeah,
Nuremberg and Company.
Right.
Sort of was the umbrella. And, but you got your people, they weren't necessarily local folk kids. You got it from the court system mostly.
yeah, they weren't all local kids. We had a population of 48 children in the institutional building, which was right there on campus. And I say institution, but at the same time, our goal was to create it as homey as possible. You know, and part of it is, again, that sense of ministry. But these are kids who were getting into trouble in the community and their family life was all messed up and so on. You know, and most of them would end up going back home. So we initiated the importance of staff in Buffalo, staff in Rochester, staff in the communities to work with the families, you know, to get the families to correct the issues that help to cause the kid to have the problem in the first place. And if the kid is going back home into that family, to help with that aftercare aspect. And that was a phase of the program that we developed, you know, over the years, and it became really important. Gustavus Adolphus started in 1886 as a ministry of the Lutheran Church, because back in those days there were orphans around, you know, they don't exist as much anymore, thank heavens, but there were orphans, and the Catholics had a head start on setting up centers. And the Lutherans knew that if these Lutheran children went into a Catholic facility, guess what happens? They would become Catholic, you know. So they decided to start the Lutherans, the Gustavus Adolphus Children's Home in 1886. And it was the first part of the Lutheran campus, you know, and that grew with the retirement home in the 1920s and so on, and then all the other apartments and high rises and everything that's going on down there today. But
Yeah, it was very much involved. In fact, we used to play those guys, the Gustavus Adolphus and basketball and stuff like that.
yeah,
They were good. You know, the Olympics
yeah,
specifically.
right.
Holy cow. I don't know where you recruited them, but they were too good.
They happened to be from the Chautauqua County, in fact.
that right?
Yeah,
That was George and Ralph, and there might have been a third.
yeah.
You know, you were talking about orphans, and that's how Gustavus Adolphus was really orphanage, and then subsequently became a children's home. But that also bespeaks one of the things that you talk about publicly, and you've written about, is on the Buffalo Orphan Asylum and Settlement of Swedes in northwestern Pennsylvania and western New York, a book that's been you and John Everett Jones and Jennifer Leiber Rains. Fascinating story. Can you give us a kind of a Reader's Digest of that?
Well, we've all heard the story about how the Swedes came over and then rode the Erie Canal over to Buffalo. And by the time they got to Buffalo, some of them were out of money. The goal was this would have been in 1846, I think it was. The goal was to get to the Midwest. There had been one group that had settled in Iowa the year before. So they were going out to meet with them. But there was about 11, a bunch of them, by the time they got to Buffalo, because it's like airline passengers today. Oh, you want to ride across the Erie Canal? Oh, a trunk costs a little bit extra money. You want to eat? Oh, food costs a little bit extra money. And it was, a 3 or 4 day trip, I forget exactly, to go all the way from Albany to Buffalo. Well, they got here and they ran out of money. And so a couple of the families, Drummond and Catherine Johnson, put some of their kids into the orphanage children's home in the Buffalo area. And so they could go and work on a farm just outside Buffalo to raise money to be able to go on. Mm-hmm. And there was a language issue because these Swedish immigrants weren't speaking English at the time. And anyway, the orphanage placed these 2 young girls out to families down in Sugar Grove and Warren. And when the parents went back to visit their children, lo and behold, they weren't there anymore. So they walked from Buffalo to come down to check their children out.
Walked. Wow.
And they realized that they were actually in a pretty good setting. They were being raised well, they were healthy, and so on. So they decided to leave them there, and they formed a legal document called an indentured servant agreement that the children would stay there until they were 18, and then the parents, they could go on their own if they want. They were responsible to give them, I think it was $50 and some clothes and so on. The parents looked around this area, and it actually looks so much like Sweden in the area that they were from. The forest, the rolling hills, the running water, the lakes, and so on. So they said, this isn't bad. I'm thinking I'm going to stay here rather than continue on to Iowa. They sent somebody out to Iowa to check out there, but it was sort of a flat plain and so on. It wasn't anything like Sweden. So a group of them decided to then, 11 of them gathered together and came down and were offered jobs in Sugar Grove and Chandler's Valley, was the main area, on farms and so on. And the rest is history. But there's always that story. But with John Everett Jones, and we went up to the Buffalo Historical Society, and there was actually a book from the orphan records back in those days, and we were literally able to find the names of those Swedish kids in that book.
Wow.
So we got copies of that, so it substantiates that whole story, with what really happened, and one of my goals is to put all of this more clearly into a written pamphlet or small book itself, but it's one of those things on your bucket list that I need to get busy with. But it's, these first people that came down here, and they came to Jamestown, and they said, why don't you come here, why don't you come here? And more Swedes and more Swedes and more Swedes came to Jamestown. And so by 1920, Jamestown, New York, had a higher number of Swedish-born citizens of any city in the United States,
wow.
percentage of citizens. And 80% of all businesses were either managed or owned by Swedes in the Jamestown area. you know, and it's the history of the power plant and all that we take for granted these days. And this has been part of the identity of this community, you know, which led to the realization that the descendants of these first settlers are now second generation, third generation removed. And every year with intermarriage with even Italians, but marriage Italians or whoever the group may be, your culture gets diluted. You know, once you lose the language, you lose a lot about culture. And so it occurred to me that we've got to be able to pass this on somehow. So the idea of starting a Culture Day program at the college came up. So in 1998 we started this through the Scandinavian Studies program, where we would bring in instructors who could teach various skills and crafts and so on. And it was free and open to the public. I remember calling Ragna Hemdahl Munson, who did Hardanger embroidery, a very delicate type of handiwork. And I asked her, would you consider doing this? She says, for sure. She says, I've always been worried about what's going to happen when I'm gone. You know, I'd like to pass this on. So that kind of mentality created with this. And so this has been going on since 1998,
Wow.
except for a couple COVID time period,
Sure.
which everything sort of shut down. But and it's still free and it's still open to the community, and we're meeting once a month. And I'm desperately looking for somebody to come and take it over, because 1998 to 2026 is a long time, and I'm getting older. I'm not going anyplace, but I'd like to have somebody, but nobody's stepping up. Nobody's saying, okay, I'll help you, or I'll take it over for you. You know, you train me or whatever. It's not happening. So, I mean, I'm hoping that something like that will happen. That's how I sort of got into this whole Swedish business, because, again, it was helping to fill this vacuum that wasn't there. Prior to me, Gerald Hagelin, that we all know, organized many Swedish events in the community. And he was the person who was doing that kind of a thing. You know, and he would sometimes have us come and play accordion music and the folk dancers and so on. And he had events at Chautauqua, very busy person.
And
I
the
don't
Swedish
know-
Hour.
Hmm?
The Swedish Hour.
Hour on the radio station. And I don't know if he ever thought about what's going to happen when I pass on. But again, there was this vacuum. And not that I could ever step into his shoes, but I realized that there's stuff to save. There's stuff to pass on. There's culture that's going to lose, and that's resulted in the Culture Day program. I was at a meeting at Lutheran and back in the early 2000s, and they were looking for ideas for fundraisers. And I said, how about a Scandinavian folk festival? And they thought, that's an interesting concept. So in 2002, we held a Scandinavian folk festival at the Lutheran campus. Well, it soon became clear that a festival is a great event, but it's not going to be a big money maker, you know, which isn't. So it was at Lutheran for 2 years, and then it moved. We actually spent 1 year at the old skating rink up at Allen Park,
Remember it
that
well.
empty building up there. And then we went to Gary Rodeo Grounds and Jamestown Community College, and now we're at the Northwest Arena. For the first couple of years, I was not the director of that, but then took that over when we started later on. So again, it grew to some years, our budget just for that weekend was something like $65,000, and you got to be a crazy Swede to think, okay, now where am I going to get $65,000, to be able to put on this thing? But it worked. We got some grant money, we got money from here, we got donations from the community, from organizations, from individuals, and so on. And what I soon realized is that if you provide a quality, authentic event that is not there just for the purpose to make money, people appreciate that. And people appreciate contributing to that. People appreciate being part of it. And that's what's been the key over all this time. And none of this would occur. I'm sort of like a catalyst of pulling something together, but it's the people, the volunteers and the artists and the performers and so on. They're the ones who make these events. I don't make the events. But the same thing comes around now. We need somebody to help with that, somebody to take it over, and it's going well. We've paid all our bills. We've never gone in the hole. We're doing fine. It's not like we have a lot of money in the bank or anything, but we're getting excited for this year's festival, July 18 and 19 at the Northwest Arena. We finally moved inside, much to the chagrin of many people, because outside is the fun part in the summer, with the music and the dancing and all that. But there were years when it rained forever, and we were walking through puddles, and one year it was so hot, even the radio stations were saying, stay in the house, you can't go out, don't go outside. And here we have an outside festival. And so we thought the only thing that we can't control is the weather. And that's why we're at the Northwest Arena, because we can control the weather, because we're inside.
Well, it really works. It really does work.
Yeah. And they provide a tremendous amount of support. And, we've had hundreds of volunteers over the years. But that gets harder and harder and harder and harder to get volunteers. And with the infrastructure there, we need less volunteers, too, to be able to pull it off. But
Well, as long as you keep the core burgers available, that's all that really matters.
that's what counts, yeah.
Well, there's a story behind that, Norm Owen.
Yep.
And why don't you recount the crazy core burger of all things?
Well, Norm Owen had been a meat cutter all his life, and he as a kid, he tells us how he used to go to the Swedish meat market and help out and so on, and it gradually grew into a job, and then he became a meat cutter and so on. And he was president for a long time of the American Scandinavian Heritage Foundation, and he had the idea of taking the core of meat and not putting it into the skin, but to bake it like a meatloaf. Mm-hmm. And then you would slice it into patty kinds of things and put it in a rye bread bun, not a white bread bun that you can buy, a rye bread bun that you can't buy those anywhere around. You got to special order them from Eckloff to get rye bread buns. So he did that, and it really became a hit, and it's like the world famous core burgers. And now you can go to Eckloff's and some other places, and they have them year-round, core burgers, which again is probably the only place in the world where you can do that.
Yeah.
So we still have them.
Well, I remember my mother religiously worked in all temperatures for the Crazy Core Burger.
Yeah.
And I interviewed Norm, so that's out there as well. A little bit about that. Well, you know, and I think about Don, you know, you've become the Swedish identity in the community. And I know you probably will not necessarily think that, but you creating culture days, be involved in culture days, folk festivals, Svenska Spelman.
We restarted the Swedish Hour on WRFA, the Radio for the Arts. Back when that radio station first started, they were saying, this is a community radio station. If anybody from the community has something they want to be part of the station, let us know. So I went down and talked to Dennis Drew, who actually lives across the street from me. And he said, sure. So, I mean, the Swedish Hour had been on WJTN for umpteen million years with Inge Kilberger, I guess it was, and Gerald Hagelin we mentioned, and so on over the years. And it was always on Sunday. And those stations are there to make money. And so you needed to get sponsors, you know, for the programs and so on. And that became burdensome. So when Gerald passed, that all stopped. And I thought, we still need the Swedish Hour. So I went down and talked to Dennis Drew. And we were within 2 months of when that radio station started, we had that going for an hour. And it's been playing ever since. Most recently, it's been Jed Bajota, who was born and raised in Sweden, who can easily talk the Swedish language, and so she does it in Swedish and in English and so on. So she's been doing it for many, 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 many years. And we have listeners from Sweden,
Oh, really?
you know, who listen. So we rebroadcast the program at 3 a.m. locally, which becomes 9 a.m. in Sweden. So on Sunday morning. So we have regular people who there, you know, listen. In fact, one time on flying to Sweden, we had a stopover at Iceland to change planes, and we were waiting. And I was there when I knew that the Swedish Hour was on. So I went to where there was an internet, and I listened to the Swedish Hour in Reykjavik, Iceland.
Hey, golly.
Crazy small world. So she gets listeners from a broad area because I don't know, again, of any other hour weekly program of Swedish music. Even in Sweden, you can't get a radio station that plays folk music. I mean, there are times when they have specials and so on, because they're into all this modern rock and roll and all this kind of stuff. And so that's another part of restoring that. And again, now we're looking for somebody who also would like to take that over. So it's one of those volunteer, no pay things. But WRFA, I guarantee you, has the largest collection of Swedish CD music in their banked library of over 200 CDs of Swedish, Norwegian, Scandinavian music in their repertoire. So that the person could say, okay, on CD number 48, play track 5 and 7, you know, kind of a thing. So it's sort of built up over the years. But I bet you there isn't any other station that has 200 Swedish CDs in their library.
That's remarkable. I did not, I mean, I've listened to it, but I didn't have an extent of it all. I mean, all of those things, culture days, folk festivals, the Svenska Spelman, the Swedish Hour, just the fact that you've encouraged and have created Swedish history, which ultimately was recognized on the Norden Club's 100th anniversary. All of a sudden, the king of Sweden, is here at a private, not-for-profit organization, not a state visit to visit the municipality. He came here to the Norden Club.
For their 100th anniversary.
100th anniversary, and while here, he, together with the Queen Sylvia in 2013, gave you the Order of the Polar Star, and it doesn't get any bigger than that.
A complete surprise. so overwhelming, you know, to have that happen. That particular prize is given to people outside of Sweden who are doing something to help to preserve the Swedish culture. And from what you say, I guess I was doing some of that at the time.
It's not what I said, it's what the world says.
You know, and didn't have a clue. That's the same one Duran Peterson received this medal. And then to have it presented in person by the king and the Queen of Sweden is just mind-boggling. I'm not sure if I have the right date in there, but 2013 or 2011, I'm not exactly sure right there, but it's in that time period. And unbelievable. You know, when they started talking about this award at the reception you were talking about, and they started listing, we have somebody, and it started to sound more and more like my history, you know. And I thought, this can't be, you know, it just can't be. But it was. People like Kurt Westrom and others were instrumental in pulling this off. And I'm so grateful for them, you know, to be able to do that. So you're standing there with the King of Sweden, and then you maybe get into a conversation after for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, again with the King and Queen of Sweden. And all of a sudden, you just realize you're just casually talking, and someone says, wait a minute. You're talking to the King of Sweden. This isn't just a casual conversation. You know, and my wife was there, and she was saying, there's a recipe that I always sort of wanted to have. And the Queen said, well, we can help you out with that. Talk to my lady in waiting over here, you know, and we'll get one sent to you, and so on. So we're talking recipes, and we're talking history, and we're talking Swedishness, and so on. You know, certainly a highlight of my life to be able to have that, and I thank those who were part of pulling it off. You know, I don't know if you were part of it then or whatever, but
My
whoever
part was
did.
merely to be there with a video camera, not knowing who was gonna get it, but I was the guy snuck his way in with the video, so folks, if I find it, I'll drop it in right at this very point, the actual ceremony when the king presented it to Don Sandy. That was magic. That really was magic.
That we are now able to honor two of our own. The Order of the Royal Star is an honor which is only awarded to foreigners and members of the royal family. It's in recognition of their efforts and activities within their Swedish community. At this time, I would like to ask L. Durand Peterson and Donald K. Sandy to come forward. Don Sandy has been the driving force behind the Scandinavian Folk Festival. Thanks to his initiative, his perseverance, and hard work, thousands of people gather here in Jamestown every summer to celebrate Midsummer, to sample Swedish food, to listen to Swedish music, and enjoy Swedish culture. Don has kept traditional folk music alive, not only as a very accomplished accordionist and leader of Svenska Spelman, but also by bringing folk musicians, choirs, and other cultural icons from Sweden to participate in the festival every summer. It is my great pleasure to ask His Majesty Carl XVI Gustaf to bestow upon each of you the insignia of Officer First Class of the Royal Order of the North Star.
Unexpected and a real honor. We really appreciate it. And Sweden is my passion, if anybody doesn't know that. And, you know, after all these years, to be able to have this recognition, it's a real privilege. And I thank the support of my wife and family and able to share this with me, and thank you very much. And for all the rest of you that made it possible.
That's a sense of pride, and you don't do it with an eye. You don't do all that you do, all the volunteer work you've done for the many 70-plus years of advancing Swedish culture to get that. But
It never occurred to me. It was just something you do, again, because there was filling a vacuum. Gerald Hagelin passed away. Who's going to do this? No way could I step into his shoes. I mean, he was a culture at another level, you know, with opera and symphonic music more so, even than the folk music that I was into. But I became, because I could see there was a need for this in the community to have a festival, to have a culture day, but it's more on a folk level. It's different. It's not like Gerald would have done it. And I'm hoping, again, like I said before, somebody else could come along, and it's not the way I'm doing it. There are many ways to skin the cat, they say. You know, there's other ways, and there's other ways of helping to preserve the culture that is the identity of many people and also of this community. You know, I mean, I still think that probably over half the people in Jamestown have a Swedish ancestor. You know, and so with this resurgence of interest in genealogy and family research and so on, I think there is more of a thirst to learn more again about what was great-grandma really like, and why did they come to Jamestown, and what was their culture and traditions in those days, you know, and that's what we want to pass on and help to educate people around.
Well, you've educated me on many occasions, and you've also educated my family, and as we draw towards closure, I'm going to ask you to pick up that accordion one more time for the benefit of my family, because you play a song which my mother requested over and over.
You know, it's the song that would say hello to the people that we left behind, because when immigrants came over back in the 1800s, the early 1900s, they didn't expect to go back to Sweden to see their mother or their siblings that they left behind and so on. So when somebody did have the opportunity to go back, people would be at the train station or whatever, singing this song, saying, "If I was a swallow, I would follow you." And so it's usually sung with a little tear in the eye because of missing home, the homeland. So happy birthday, Gladys. Hälsa dem där hemma.
to mention my family, which, again, is the most important part of my life. My wife and I got married in 1965, is that right, Ed, dear? Yeah, that's right. 1965. And our oldest son was born in 1967, Keith, who was very involved, in the community as far as he often ran track. He was a very outdoor person and so on. We had one handicapped child that was born who functioned basically as a 6-month-old baby that needed care, and he stayed with us for the first 13, 14 years of his life until we realized he was getting too big for us to handle and so on. And so it was time to get involved with a children's group home that got opened for disabled children. And in between there, we had 2 children, unfortunately, that died just before they were born, so they were at term, but they passed away. But then we had our last child is our daughter, Amelia, who married, is now an acupuncturist. She was very much into ballet, in the community here, and did all the Nutcracker routines and so on in the community. And lives in Kenmore, New York, so it's close by, fortunately. And blessed us with twins, a boy and a girl. And so that's something we enjoy, is watching them grow up and so on. They're 10 years old now already. Can't believe it. So all of this has been important, for our life, and is the most important thing. Sometimes the Swedish business that I was involved with, if you want to call it that, interfered with family life, which is the biggest regret that I ever had, was that there were times when it got to be too much, So you have to back off a little bit and get back to focusing that the family is the center, kind of a thing. I'm glad I did, because they still are, and they will always be the center. And my wife and I still live in our own house. We're both 82 years old. We're thankful for what we have. It's not like it's, you have your disappointments in life. I was, around the year 2000, I was diagnosed with colon cancer, for example. And you don't know what the result of that's going to be, but I'm a colon cancer survivor, which doesn't happen to a lot of people. And so I'm thankful that we have what we have today, being in our own house, being together, and again, still being a family. Every week I go to a nursing home and play accordion music. And you go to the Alzheimer's unit, Memory Gardens, and you start playing some Swedish music, and you see some of the people starting to mouth some of these songs, and they know it triggers something in their brain and so on. But I'm not sure where I was leading with that, but anyway, it's, again, I'm thankful for my family and for the support that they have given all along, and that's thankful that we have what we have.
Well, we're thankful that we have the Sandys, plural, in our world, and you guys have made such an incredible impact on so many fronts. You came here today, hopefully willingly, and in anticipation of that, was there a question you thought that I might ask that I haven't?
I might be a couple other little stories of adventures in Sweden.
Sure.
We ended up being fortunate to be able to go to Sweden at least 8 times. We lost track of that. And it's not because we had money to be able to go over there on vacation. Again, you got to try to figure out how to pull this off. So we started this company called Scandinavian Resources, so which included recording music and planning events and so on. But it also included importing items from Sweden to sell here. So, like we would go to a fabric store, the manufacturer in Sweden, and they got to know us after a while. So we'd go there, and my wife says it's like going into a candy shop because you got all these rolls of fabric and so on. And we particularly like the ones with Dallas designs and so on that we know it would be popular here. And I remember one year we ended up packing up 13 bolts of fabric. And you have to, again, figure out how to arrange special shipping this because you can't carry all this back with us. And you got to know what your potential is for being able to sell this stuff, because I know one year it was over $1,000 just for shipping to get this stuff back. Although one year we had just a couple of rolls that we were able to take with us. And our daughter was with us that year, and these things all wrapped up in big plastic wrap. And going through customs, our daughter says, "It's all right, Grandma, we're almost home now," tapping the bag. I'm not sure what the customs inspector thought, but anyway.
That's cute.
But while in Sweden, then we took advantage of that as far as the genealogy goes. And you go to sites that you now have identified as where your family's from. So it was in a town called Ulrika, Sweden. It's a very small town, it's just a crossroads. And we're walking around in the cemetery. But things are different in Sweden. You don't, for 70 years, if you don't pay to maintain the site, it ends up being used by somebody else. And so markers get off to the side and so on. So the odds of finding anything was nil. But meanwhile, my daughter was out there still looking around in the cemetery, and the caretaker from the church comes out. He says, "You must be from the United States because nobody in Sweden just walks around the cemetery like this." And they said, "Yeah." And they said, "My dad's family came from here." "Oh, who was that?" Well, people connected to churches often know the history and so on. And before long, he was able to identify who our relatives were.
Wow.
And he goes up to the wall in the church that was built in the 1700s. And to see that Samuel Samuelson up there, he said, "That's your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. He was the head of the committee that built this church."
Wow.
And by then I was crying a little bit. Sandy was doing something at the car. Amelia ran out to the car and said, "You better come in because Dad's crying." Stuff like that wouldn't happen unless you're right there.
Sure.
You can't pull that out of some book. So I encourage people, create the opportunity to go do this, because your Swedish ancestors are very anxious to meet you too. They want to know about their relatives that moved to the United States, etc. We had another time, we were in Helsingborg, Sweden, and we were in the city hall looking at the records. But in Sweden, the records are all written in Swedish for some reason. And I couldn't understand them and read them, so you had to go up and get a little bit of help with the translation. And this lady comes up in perfect English and says, "Look," she says, "I live here in this town, and I can come back here anytime I want. Why don't I help you for the rest of the time that you're here?
Wow.
Do this." So we did that, and she says, "I'll continue to do some research, after you go back." And we got a package in the mail of some things and so on. So the next year we went back, we wanted to thank her for it. She says, "Oh, by the way, we're cousins."
No kidding.
Again, how does that happen?
Yeah.
I mean, it goes back, not like first cousins or anything, it's like 6 or 7 generations back. We share the same great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, but we're cousins. And as it turns out, the guy at the church turned out to be a cousin too. You know, things like that, again, it's meant to be. It's just, again, wouldn't happen. So we still maintain contact as much as we can. But when we stopped doing the business, we stopped being able to afford to go to Sweden to buy more stuff, you know, bring it back and so on. And now we haven't been over for several years and miss that opportunity to say hello to our friends. I was able to coordinate, though, for the Thule Swedish folk dance team to make a 10-day trip to Sweden and work with, I think it was 8 different Swedish folk dance teams over there.
Wow.
So, and also see a lot of good sights and so on. So we pulled all that off. But again, I know of people who put off, I'm going to go someday, I'm going to go someday. But then someday never comes. You get sick. You pass, one of the partners passes away. You don't get to do it. If you have that on your bucket list, do it. Figure out how to do it because it all pays off. You know, we're able to visit the cottage in the woods that's still standing there that my relatives left in 1870. Basically a 2-room cottage that a family now uses like as a summer home kind of a thing. But it's still there. To think that this is where my great-great-grandparents lived and raised their kids and then decided to leave this to go and work on the American dream, which occurred. You know, I am who I am, you know, because of that American dream. Getting a master's degree in college, you know, that, I don't know other cousins that happened to. There could be some out there because my dad had 11 brothers and sisters and they all had 6 or 7 kids or whatever. So there was something like 55 first cousins that I had that I can't keep track of. But anyway, so all this was just possible just because, again, we figured out a way to do it. You know, it's, you sort of need to adapt to the situation and try to come up with opportunities around that. And that's what happened with the festival and with Culture Day and so on, you know. It just happens. And those are the people that make it happen, is all those volunteers, you know, and all those people that share their own identity and history with the world. Thank you.
We thank you. You're gracious in your mentioning all the volunteers, but ultimately there's a mix master in this, the guy who follows up, follows through to get it in the end zone and who orchestrates all those volunteers, and that's Don Sandy, and for that we're grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful. Well, you want to end with a song?
I could do that.
Yeah.
It was probably the first main Swedish song I learned. It's called Custer Valse. And Custer Island is a little island off the west coast of Sweden. And one of our trips over there, we were staying at a place near there. And I thought, I gotta go to Custer Island. And my friends in Sweden always arranged for me to have an accordion while I was in Sweden, so I would carry that around with me and so on. So I contacted this restaurant on Custer Island and said, I'm gonna be there on this night, can I play Custer Valse on Custer Island? And they said, sure, so that's what happened. Taxamica.
Thank you, Barsagu. Thank you. That was great. This was-